Hey, why don't we open with a word of prayer and we'll get started. Father, we come before you graciously and humbly asking that you would teach us from these words that were penned a couple thousand years ago by a guy that you literally and physically anointed to the work of an apostle to carry out such a foundation for the church, along with your disciples and other leaders that you appointed. Father, 2,000 years ago, Paul penned these words to a church at a place called Ephesus to people who are not a lot unlike us, looking, searching for meaning and purpose in our lives, and striving to live out our design that you created us to be. May these words impact our lives and our thoughts, but most of all, our behavior today as we go out and we live changed lives, not to earn anything or not because of guilt, but because of who and whose we are. So bless our moments we share together, we pray in your Son's name. Amen. Well, the country is Turkey. Most of you know that Ephesus is in the modern day country of Turkey. And at the time that this letter is written, Ephesus is a large Roman metropolis. It is the third largest city in the Roman Empire. The entire city is built around this temple to Artemis. Some of you may have looked it up. Some of you may have been there to Ephesus, made to this goddess. It's a huge city that people travel through. Lots of commerce is going on, lots of wealth, a place of many, many people, a place of many, many gods. And this is all happening around 2,000 years ago. In the midst of all of that, in this big city, rumors are starting. If you can imagine, a population of people, something's been going on in this town. People are gathering. They're sharing stories about a man named Jesus from across the sea, because you see, these people weren't walking in Jerusalem and around the Sea of Galilee. They're in Turkey. And these stories, there are faces now to these rumors they've been hearing about paralyzed people that began to walk again. People with leprosy, which back then was a certain death sentence, they were getting healed. People who were blind, who were able to see again. And they heard about a Roman government who killed this man, but this man walked out of his tomb 3 days later. This is the talk in the town of Ephesus. And so can you imagine if you were there and you're hearing about this for the first time? You've maybe heard enough to say, I need to check this out. I need to go and I need to hear, and I'm going to begin to follow this. This makes sense. This is powerful. This is what we've been looking for. And you can imagine a couple, a family who said, we're going to follow this. In essence, in Ephesus, what they would be doing was turning their back on everything they knew and going up against culture that was pushing everything against them. And now they're there, and they're sitting there, and they're asking, what are we supposed to do? Have you been there in your own life? This is where they are. We hear it. We've seen it. Now we're hearing the stories. We're gathering with these people. So what? Now what? How do we grow? What does this, what we call Christianity, look like once you've made the decision to follow? And everyone else around you seems to be against you. They wouldn't have a Bible. These people didn't have the New Testament. It was being written. They don't have the teachings of Jesus in red letters. They've heard a man named Paul who came and talked to them and told them all these stories. They know a guy named Timothy who sort of leads this little, what they call a church. And you go there with others, but it must have been a really scary time. It must have been really shaky and uncertain. And the questions must have come up. What do we do? Here we are. We believe. We believe in this. What do we do now? What comes next? Have you been there in your own walk with the Lord? What do? I come to church. I'm at Marketplace Bible Study. What comes? And then this letter comes. Right in the nick of time. This letter, Paul's letter to the church that gathered at Ephesus, the letter that we call Ephesians. And so Paul starts this church, and he writes back and he says, here is how you live the Christian life once you've made that decision. This would finally give people something to go on. And I hope when you leave here today that you walk out and you understand maybe a little bit more. What am I supposed to do with this? Where do I go with this? Some of you undoubtedly are sitting going, I know all that. Well, maybe you feel a little exhorted to begin to look at your life and how this letter is being played out in your life so that people can see the letter written on your heart, known and read by all in your spheres of influence. You ever got to that point where you say, I'm a Christian, but what do I do now? I remember the first time that I became a pastor in a little town in Wisconsin. I was talking to some of you about that. I was in this little church in this little town. I just graduated from Bible college. I was freshly married, and I sat down at my desk, and I literally thought, now what do I do? I literally called my wife on the phone. I said, here I am at this church. I'm a pastor. What do I do? And that was the beginning of my journey as a pastor. Now I've had to hold on for the ride of my life, and it really has been all of that. But we ask the same thing when, as Christians, many times we get it. We have a Bible now. I've come to church. I've got my coffee. I'm sitting down. Now how does this work? And so I want to look at basically 8 verses together. We stopped at Ephesians 4:16. And I want to start at verse 17. And Paul begins it in the ESV at the words now. Now, or NIV would say, so then, so. And so that obviously infers, because of all these first 4 chapters that Paul has given to us, now, here we are, now, here we are. For 4 chapters, Paul has fans a flame of this church that he started in the midst of a culture that had many, many gods. People would come to Ephesus and hear about Greek gods and goddesses. They would buy idols and sell and worship them. In the midst of this, people hear, what do they hear about? One God. Well, wait a minute. One God? That's the rumor that's going around Ephesus. Yeah, there's one God. There's only one truth. Wait a minute. This goes against everything the Greeks have been trying to teach and do for hundreds and hundreds of years. There are lots of gods. If you remember in Acts 17, they even had an altar to an unknown God, just in case they missed one. And this is the culture that they're living in. And Paul says, no, there's one truth, one God, one body, one spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God. Do you see why there would be tension in this church? At a mono or polytheistic environment where it says there are many gods? Who are you? And this oneness would create a unity in this body that the world would see the power of God moving, uniting diverse people of all different backgrounds. People who were murderers and stealers, highly influential, educated people, all coming together, men and women, children and grown-ups, gathered together, oneness. And this town would witness this incredible supernatural unity. And we talked a couple of weeks ago about the power of one. That there's power in that as a church. There's power as we get along with one another. And yet in so many of our church and our lives, we divide so quickly. But working through those divisions, the disagreements that you have with people, agreeing on the fundamentals, the non-negotiables of the faith should bind us together. There are a lot of things we can disagree on, but there are a few things that we must agree on. And it's imperative that we get that as the church because the world needs to see unity. Because we live in a place where we're seeing everything but unity, aren't we? And this is the culture that we're in. We talk about the power of many. That you are many men that are sitting here right now, that God has gifted each of you with that shape, that design. You're wired in a way to do God's work that he prepared for you to do way before he thought up this idea of the world and man, which he always knew. But he had a job for Harry and for Dick, for each one of us to do. We have a role to play. So there's power in the church when many of us are playing our role. And then we talked about how powerful a healthy church is for the world to look on and see. These people in Ephesus, they would have heard stories about Jesus. And now in Paul's letter, it's time to connect the dots. That's what his letter is doing. In the first 4 chapters, Paul reminds them there's one God who created you, who loves you. And he loves you not because of who you are, but because of whose you are, right? He made you. And he loved you. Even while we were enemies, Christ died for us. So it wasn't a condition that we did or something we did. But all of us here would admit we have broken that relationship with God. Every single one of us have all done wrong. We've all played the part in our lives of being God, haven't we? We all know that. We all have a BC in our lives. We all have a before Christ. And so God redeemed every one of us in this room if you've committed your life to Christ. He brought you back, sent his only son to die on the cross to pay for anything that you might have done to yourself or to someone else. The Bible declares it's paid in full. It is covered. And yet there are many of us that live, as Rustin talked about at the very beginning of our year together, we have strongholds in our hearts and in our lives, agreements that we've made with ourselves and with the world and with our enemy that many of you have been holding on for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. That Paul says, we don't have to. The sin is paid for. It's covered. You have been redeemed. There's a new way to live. And now he wants a relationship with us. This God, all-powerful, creator of all, wants an intimate relationship with us. We're one body, the church, and this is something that we do together. Recently, we talked about, a couple weeks ago, how each one of us, as I mentioned, we have a role to play. We're not just allowed to be in the family of God, we've got responsibilities in the families of God. So are you with me on that? You have a role to play. God, Christ, died for you, shed his blood, rose again, ascended into heaven, declared that he would be with you always, but we are to go and to make disciples in this world. And I'm going to give you power, and you're going to begin in Jerusalem, Judea. You're going to go to people you don't like very much in Samaria, and you're going to go to the uttermost parts of the earth. As you are faithful and obedient to me, I'm going to empower you to be the church. It's an amazing thing, my spirit in you. And of course, this begs the question that many of us ask, then if that's all amazing, why don't I feel like it? Have you been there? I've got the power of God in me. I'm part of this one church. I get a role to play in the body. Why am I not feeling different? What's going on? Why don't I feel gifted? Why don't I feel as though I'm being used by God? In fact, I feel like I'm just a guy sitting in a chair on a Wednesday morning at a men's Bible study, desperately looking for something. What is going on? And Paul says, let me tell you, this is how it's done. This is what it looks like. Look at verse 17, and I don't have the PowerPoint up here. I was too lazy. I ran out of time. Whatever you want to think. But I put the scripture on your outline there, and hopefully some of you brought your Bibles with you. Paul says, now, I've given you all of this. Now let me tell you what this looks like. This I say and testify in the Lord, that you must no longer walk. You might want to underline that phrase. No longer walk as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their minds. And then he describes them in verse 18. These that walk as the Gentiles do, they're darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, due to their hardness of heart. Verse 19, they have become callous and have given themselves up to sensuality, which doesn't mean sex per se, it just means to the senses. Whatever I hear, whatever I want to see, whatever I want to feel, the ultimate hedonistic lifestyle, it's all about me. It's all about what I feel and what I want. He said they're greedy to practice every kind of impurity. So Paul's writing to say, if you call yourself a Christian, you have an old life that you need to depart from. You can't live in that old life any longer. You are living like those when you do that. You're living like people who don't know God. You are ignorant. Ignorant doesn't mean stupid. These people weren't dumb. These people weren't they were educated people, philosophers, all of that. They were ignorant just in the sense that they lacked the knowledge of what was true. 2 Corinthians 4:4, Paul reminded the church that the God of this age has blinded the hearts and the minds of the unbelieving, so they can't see the truth. They can't see the light of the gospel, who's Jesus. They are truly blocked from the truth. They are hardened to God's voice because they don't have the Spirit living in them. They don't have a sensitivity to how the Spirit might be moving. So they're simply giving themselves over. They're living out what they know. This is why when I meet non-Christian people, I don't try to change their behavior first. I want to introduce them to Jesus Christ. Like Barry was talking about last week. I want to live my life in such a way they say, what is different about you that is attracting me to something? I want to hook my wagon up to your life. And so when they are cursing or living out their life the way they do, I'm not going to shame them. I believe once they meet the Christ that I'm following, that his Spirit will change them. And they'll want to depart from the old life, and they'll desire to live this new life. Let me ask you a question. Do you remember your old life? Do you remember the time in your life where your heart was hardened before God? Do you remember never having enough? Do you remember that season of your life where everything, that promised so much, the law of diminishing returns, it delivered so little? And you would go after it. You never would have enough. You never paid enough. You never found that one vice that would ever provide enough of escape in your life. Do you remember that? You had to have more and more of that just to get back to the same level of satisfaction, whatever it might have been. Do you remember when going through life that you were only concerned about who you hang out with, who you drank with, who you worked with, how you performed, how people perceived you? It consumed you, didn't it? It was like being on a hamster wheel that never stopped. Do you remember never being satisfied with that? It's a crazy cycle of chasing and constantly coming up empty. There are people whose lives are characterized by that. There are some of you that are sitting here that are saying, gosh, I'm still battling that. I'm still living my life the same way. Then it's good that you're here this morning. Paul's writing, reminding them that that's the way they used to live. It was a life that lacked any kind of fulfillment. You would do things, but it never really delivered. It lacked meaning. You were living a life that really had no purpose other than, I can't wait to get that next car. I can't wait to go on that next vacation, maybe that next promotion, and that was all you had. And you would get there, as a friend of mine once said, once I got to the top of the corporate ladder, I realized that there was nothing here. And it was a great point of disillusionment for him. And Paul's reminding him, this is the way you used to live. Solomon in Ecclesiastes would call it a chasing after the wind. We know the wind's there, we see it, but we can never catch it in the palm of our hands. And Paul says, you can't live that way. There's a better way, a new way, a new life. You found a Christ that died for your old life. He doesn't want any part of that old life. He doesn't want to be the God of your old life. He's the God of your new life. And so Paul insists in a commanding sort of way as he writes this letter, don't live this way any longer. And then here's how it works. Look at verse 20. He said, that's not the way you learned Christ, assuming that you have heard about him and were taught in him as the truth is in Jesus. He says this, put off, and you might want to circle that little phrase, to put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires, and be renewed in the spirit of your minds. You might want to circle the phrase, be renewed. And then verse 24, and to put on, underline or circle, put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. I look at that phrase, put off my old self. Now that makes sense. You see, when I come to Christ, the hardest thing for me, I don't know about you, is me. The biggest struggle I have in my Christian journey is my old nature that seems to keep creeping up on me and hanging on, even though I've declared myself a follower of Christ. And Paul says, this is how you take the next step. Begin to put off. Begin to renew your mind and begin to take on 3 building blocks of what this looks like in our life. 3 steps, if you will. You might want to jot down Psalm 119, 105, a verse that I go to often because I think that was so true in the way God works, that your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Paul gives us a step, and that light illuminates another step. Put off this old nature, and that illuminates another step. Be renewed in the spirit of your mind, which leads to another step. Put on this new nature. And each step of maturity in Christ lights up another one in our lives. It's a beautiful thing. And so let's hit the pause button right there in this passage. And that took us to about verse 24. And ask the question, who's Paul talking to here? He's talking to people who are saying, what does it look like? The people that are sitting in that church, they need this letter. We need this letter. We need to hear, we need to see, what does it look like? It's why we have people's stories up here. You have a story. Some of you are going to share that. Share that with each other at breakfast today, those of you that go out. Walk with each other. Share our stories with each other. And he's going to go after, I think, certain lies that we believe about Christian growth, about maturity, about what this looks like. And I want to, on your outlines there, just address 4 different lies about spiritual growth, talk about them, and then hopefully if we have some time at the end, I want to ask you some questions about your own life. And here's a first lie that I believed for a long time, and I thought it was this: is spiritual growth happens automatically. And I used to think that, okay, I'm a follower of Christ. I'm going to go to church and I'm going to go out to the Bible study, every Bible study I can get my hands on, every group I can be a part of. And over time, I'm going to grow. But that was never the truth. The reality is that spiritual growth is a process that takes time. And that's a couple of blanks in your outline. You ADD people want to stay with me on that. That's it. It's a process that takes time. It's one that has to be intentional, and it takes time. Think of anything that you've mastered. It just took time. I remember on May 28, 1988, it'll be 28 years ago this day, I got married. May 28, 1988. So May 28, 2016, that'll be 20, don't tell me, 28 years, I think. And but on that day, 1988, I became the most amazing husband that Karen could ever have. On that day, 1988. Now, you laugh, right? Because you know that's not true. What happened on May 28, 1988 is I started basically proving to my wife that I had no clue how to be a good husband. And I never had any idea. I wanted to be a good husband. I wanted to be married in a culture that's increasingly opposed to marriage, that families were breaking down and everything. I wanted to be the guy. I want to be that good guy, that the husband that made the difference. It wasn't the 50% statistic that we throw out and we hear about marriages ending every one and two. And so on May 29th and on May 30th, and basically up until about now, I've been learning how to become a husband. I still am. If you were to talk to Karen today, she would say, he's about 65% there in terms of the man that I want to be. She might lie to you, but really, I'm getting there. The point is, it's taken a lot of time. The covenant of marriage, that contract, it's been the toughest one I've ever had to live up to. But it takes time. How about sports? Those of you that are athletic. Can you imagine if I went down to Rio this summer and got to the front door and said, I'm here to do the 100-meter dash. Sign me up for the 200-meter butterfly. They'd look at me and go, are you crazy? You don't just sign up for that. People invest their whole lives into training, into preparing for that one moment. Many of you guys play golf. Need I say more, right? It takes time to learn how to master. No, forget it. No, most of us don't. It's funny that cursing doesn't take much time to learn when you're on the golf course, right? That just happens instantly. What about musical? You guys that are musical, instruments, art, business, whatever it is, it just takes time. But it's amazing when it comes to walking with God. We walk into a church, we get it in business. We understand that in life. We even get it in relationships, that it takes time for us to grow together. But we come to church and we walk into the church, or we come into Marketplace Bible Study and we grab our bagel and our donut. Maybe some of you grab several, and we grab our coffee and we sit down. We shake some hands with people and we enjoy the time together. But we wonder why we're not growing, because growing with God takes time. It doesn't just happen. It'll take time. We've got to be committed to that at our core and being intentional of what we're striving for. I'll tell you, when I reached 40 years of age, which is now way back in my rearview mirror, even though I looked young, it was harder to lose weight. How many of you guys relate to that? Over 50, it's really hard to shed the pounds. And yet you know what to do. You just got to eat less and exercise more. Do you ever go to a club around here? It's a big thing, right? You go to the club and they have all these deals for $10 an hour. I signed up. My wife and I signed up for a club. But the point is, we actually have to go to the club. And we actually have done that. We kind of make a day. I'll walk into the club. And do you ever see people in the club who are just sitting there and they've got their carrot juice, smoothie, smacky, banana, whatever it is, and they're sipping it like they just love it, and they got a towel over their shoulder. Maybe someone's sitting on a machine and they've got their phone out and they're trying to but I see people in there all the time that are walking around, they're getting water. They even come up the machine and they're giving people a little bit of advice on how to lift, but I don't see them working out. A lot of people in there. They show up, they drink the smoothie, they put the towel over, they sit on a machine, they play with their phone, and I'm not seeing them change. What inspires me when I go into a club? Somebody who looks like they're fit. Somebody who's on that treadmill. Somebody who's lifting those weights, and I'm looking, okay, I can be that guy. But I see so many people that walk into a club and they sit around and they talk to a few people, and after about an hour, they look and say, well, I got to get out of here. I'm like, did you do anything? Is anything changing? And they're probably not going to change. We do the same thing when we come out to church and we just get our coffee, which I've got in my bucket here. If you're behind me, sorry I didn't leave any for you. Or we shake a few hands and we hang out and then we leave. And we may feel frustrated, like I'm going to all these different groups, but nothing's changing in me. Because Paul's saying there's a new you that needs to come into place. Some of us have spent 50, 60, 70 years. You can go 80 years going to church, shaking hands, even knowing Greek and Hebrew, knowing so much of the Bible, and never change spiritually. That's what Paul is saying here. That's the tragedy. And so spiritual growth doesn't just happen automatically. That's what I want you to hear. God is supernatural. God is all powerful, but he doesn't do it automatically, which leads to a second lie, and that is that God is the one who makes us grow spiritually. Now, before you run out of here going, what are you saying? God is all... Hear me out on this. God motivates us. God has given us the truth. God empowers us. He fills us with his Spirit. We have all of his power at our disposal, but we have to act on it. That's the truth. God is the one who makes us grow spiritually is not a true statement. You're not a robot. God did not create Adam and Eve with one tree in the garden, a tree of life. There was a tree of life, and there was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And God said, I'm putting within your soul, in your spirit, the desire or the willingness to make choices in your life. I want you to choose to be with me, to follow me. And yet we know the story of Adam and Eve. We have to act on it. God did not create robots in the garden. The moment you become God's, he puts everything in front of us, everything we need to live that life. So here's the reality blank. God's the one who makes us grow spiritually. That's the second lie. The reality is it's a result of our daily decisions. Every day, Jesus said, take up your cross and follow me. He didn't say, I'm going to take it up. You take up your cross and follow me. You follow me. Look at verse 17 in Ephesians 4. You must no longer walk. Who must no longer walk? You must no longer walk. Whose responsibility is that? Your responsibility. You have to make a decision to not live this way anymore. Verse 19, they've given themselves up. Who's the they? They made the decision. They decided to harden their hearts. You and I make a decision. Verse 22, put off your old self. God doesn't say, hey, don't worry about it. I'm going to put off your old self for you. There's something you're doing. You put off your old self. We have to decide. Again, don't hear me wrong on this. God has given us everything at our disposal. We can get into theological debates about predestination and foreknowledge and all of that, but that'll go in circles. Well, the commandment here is that God has given us everything, and you put on your new self. You do it. God will give you the strength, but you daily ask God. You daily make decisions. You make the choice. Look at Philippians 2:12, if you want to flip back there. This is a church in Philippi, struggling with some of the same questions. A church planted by Paul, saying something, what do we do? How do we live this out? And Paul says in Philippians 2:12, he says, therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, he says this incredible phrase, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Work out your own salvation? That's a little crazy. What is that all about? He goes on, he says, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Who works it out? You work it out. Now notice the phrase in Philippians 12, work out, it doesn't say you work it out for salvation. That's an important distinction in there. He says you work it out. You don't work for your salvation. We work it out with fear and trembling. How salvation looks in our life. God saved us. Jesus died for us. We've been predestined. We've been called. We've been adopted as his sons and daughters. Now live like it. Live out your salvation in your life. God works in us to make that happen, and we have a part to play in the process. Does that make sense? Guys, does that make sense? Just give me a head nod if you're with me on this. And you're like, no, let's get out of here really fast. God motivates. He empowers us. We have to act on it. It's like a good coach in sports. God is always with us. The coach is with them. We got Super Bowl week. We're in here. That coach is behind us. There is a game plan. Everybody has a position to play. We need to get in there and play our position. We've got to be in the game. And Paul's encouraging the church in Ephesus. He encourages the church in Philippi, and dare I say the church at Scottsdale, these churches to be in the game. Don't just come and go through the motions. Don't just come and sit for an hour and shake some hands and think you're going to be growing. Be careful of that. Your reaction might be right now, yeah, you're right. You're saying, Neil, I get it. I gotta read my Bible more. I got to get to another study. I got to get more things going on. I've got to learn a lot more in my life. Be careful. Or you say things like, I want to get deeper. Be careful, guys. Sometimes when you say deeper, ask yourself, what do I mean by deeper? I'm going to tell you what you mean by deeper, or what deeper really means. We think deeper is opening this and just getting more of this in us. That's good. But I'll tell you what deeper really means in our life. It means learning to behave or put this into play in your life, which leads to the third lie. I'll grow more when I start learning more. I'll grow more when I start learning more. Now, is there anything wrong with learning? Is there anything wrong with learning? No. Study the Word of God. Study to show thyself approved. Get into this. Own it. Eat it like Jeremiah would do. Is eat the Bible, all that things. Get it in you, whatever you have to do. But that's not going to be the thing that makes you grow. The reality is it's more about behavior than it is about belief. It's not about learning more. It's about how we live, not what we know. You know, James was a half-brother of Jesus. There's a book in the New Testament by his name. I had to think that, and it took his family a while to really understand that we had the Messiah living in our house. Jesus is my sibling. Yeah, imagine how hard that must have been to convince. If your brother came up to you and said, I'm Jesus, that would be a pretty tough one to convince you of. You would think he was crazy. You'd have to do something like rise from the dead or something. Oh yeah, Jesus did that for James, right? And I can imagine that when Jesus' family saw that, when they saw that Jesus really was who he claimed to be, what must have been going on in their lives. It'd be hard to pull that one over on a sibling. And James writes in chapter 2 of his book, James 2:14, he says, what good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? And he'll go on right all the way down to verse 26, and he has this conversation about, you say you have faith. Probably everyone in this room would say, I have faith. But your life doesn't reflect any of what you believe. James is saying, can that say faith you? Faith save you? Can that kind of faith save you? If you say you believe all these things, but your life doesn't match up, is that a real faith? This is what James says. I'm not going to tell you that I have faith. I'm going to show you by the way that I live that I believe. Which kind of faith is a real one? Talking about it or living it? Every one of us would say, this is the real faith. Living out what we know is real, true, alive, and authentic faith. And he ends this section in James simply by saying faith without works is what? It's useless. It's dead. It's good for nothing at all in our lives. You say it's also about knowing more. James says, you know what? Demons know more. Demons are way ahead of you on this one. They understand it, and they actually shudder. They tremble. You think it's about knowing more. Demons, they've got this one. How much faith do you think demons have? They don't live it out in their lives. Knowledge is part of the process. There's no doubt about it. And Jesus said, we got to know. But he says, but what Jesus says, they'll know you are my disciples by the way you what? Love one another. They're going to know you are my disciples by the way you love. That's love, not learn. Love, not learn. When you start acting on all these things that you're living, you're doing a great job. So many of us will go tomorrow morning. Doc's got a study at Mountain Valley at 7 o'clock. Is that right? Shameless plug, product placement out there. A lot of you guys are going to go to that. Some of you guys are going to go to, Tom Schrader has a study, I think on Friday morning. Churches begin all weekend long. You might be in one of 3 different small groups. But when you start acting on what you're studying, that's when you know you're growing. There's a story, some of you may know this, about an old pastor and a missionary. He'd gone to a native group, and he preached the gospel to a native community. They received the gospel, and they said, wow, this makes sense. We've been praying to the creator in our culture, and this is the name for that creator, Jesus the Christ. And they began a church and began to worship, and the pastor leaves. And years later, he comes back to that group of those Native Americans, and he asks them how they're doing, how they're growing in their life. And the chief looks and says, it's like new dog and old dog in me, always fighting. That's really an interesting picture. And the missionary says to him, well, which dog wins? And the chief says, He goes on, dog I feed most. Dog I feed most. And this is what Paul's writing about. There's two natures in you. There's an old nature and a new nature that are warring within us. There's a new self that battles with the old self. These Christians in Ephesus were going up against everything in culture, completely across the grain. That's what happens when you make a decision in Christ. Your nature fights against that, your flesh, your old desires, and there's this tension. Which one wins? Well, the one I feed the most, the one I'm putting the time and energy in. You go to the club and you're trying to fight the battle of your weights, but you keep eating awful food and you keep sitting on a machine doing nothing. You're not going to change. The old person wins, and it's the same spiritually. There's more about how I live than what I know. It's why we've got to be intentional, men. It's why we've got to get beyond, this experience. It's why I say often, and I don't chastise people, but I know that we like to run around from group to group to group because I love it. Who doesn't love Marketplace Bible study? I do. I love hearing me speak all the time, right? But we love turning on the radio. We love turning on the computer, getting all this information. But there's an old Amy Grant song from the 80s that says, when you do that and you don't live it out, you're just becoming a fat little baby. You're just growing and growing and growing, but you're not living out on anything in your life. Well, there's a last lie. And that's the lie that I can do it alone, and most of us get that. God never created Christianity to be an individual sport. The reality is that God wants us to grow in the context of family. So the lie is I can do it alone. The reality is God wants us to grow up in family. God knows there's strength in numbers that gather together. I run into people all over this area that will find out or that I go to Scottsdale Bible Church. Some of you go to some different churches. That's great, whatever it might be. And they'll say things to me, I know all about your church, which always makes you nervous because I'll say, it's not my church. I'm always waiting for what they're going to say next. Whatever you're going to say about the person that that goes to the church, not my church. They're not my people. And but I go to your church, and they're usually very intrigued by that. So in one sense, I'm very proud in a good way of our people when I think about what they think about Scottsdale Bible Church when they see our people. And I talk to people at our church. And when I listen to their story about how they came to the church, you know why they came? It wasn't because we have a great pastor, we have these great ministries necessarily. It's because you invited them. It's because they had a relationship with you and they saw change in your life. I go to a health club, I've never seen a health club brochure that ever shows, some fat guy on a treadmill. It's always somebody in spandex looking really great because that's what sells. You want to sell the vision of that. And when people go out and they are the church, when they see life change in you, that there is an old nature, that you still battle, but they see somebody having victory where the world is having no victory at all. That's attractive. And most of the people I talk to that go to our church, and hopefully your church too, their life change was because of you. And that's an awesome, awesome thing. Many of us understand we were meant to grow up in the family of God. I've met people who say, well, I don't go to church anymore. And that sounds so cool. I love God. I get the whole Jesus thing. I think it's awesome. I'm just not really into organized religion. Have you heard people say that before? I'm not into the organized religion. I'm like, well, it's God that kind of organized religion. And God created us to all be together. And guess what? Heaven's going to be in eternity. All of us in community. So this idea that I can go it alone, that I can be this maverick who loves God and I love Jesus, I'm all into the spiritual part of it, but without people, you're drinking the wrong drink. You are studying the wrong thing. You're missing the point because it's all in the context of community. I may not like you very much, Doc, and I do like you, but our act of loving each other anyways, only Christians can do by the power of the Spirit in us. And the practice of me loving you, which is very hard to do, helps me grow spiritually. I can sit here and say all I want. I love you, I love you, I love you, right? But if I still act cold towards you, if I still ignore you, I still just have a little bit of tension with you, or I don't even pursue a relationship with you, do I really love you? Not at all. And so it's the same thing in our own lives. If we can talk a talk, and I see it happen all the time in churches, and study a study, but if it's not lived out, um, especially in the context of community, is it real? James argue that it's probably not. It's why Jesus will say to many people, away from me, you never knew me. You said a lot of good things. You did religious things, but I never really knew you. I think of the people who have had bad church experiences. I've had a dime for everybody who came back to me and said, I've been so wounded by the church. I got to tell you, you've been wounded by the church. Get that out of your vocabulary right now. People wound people. And I've seen books written, good people writing good books. I've been so wounded by the church. If you are wounded by the church, please come up and talk. I want to have coffee with you. I will tell you stories that'll make the hair on your back curl about how I've been wounded by the church. But it's the church, and it's filled with fallen people. Fallen people are hurting. Hurting people hurt people, and that may be real, but I don't give up on the church. I don't stop coming to church because I've been wounded by the church like it's some badge I wear that God has a merit badge, and the church is bad. No, the church is God's construct, the community living together. I'll tell you this. I got sick from eating food once. Has that ever happened to anybody? I got food poisoning. It wasn't a happy time, but I never gave up on food, and neither have any of you, obviously. We still love food, right? So why would we take a negative church experience, or why would we take something, I'm just out, I'm not into the whole organized thing? It's all about people. And so this lie that I can go it alone is that. It's a lie. And spiritual maturity means that we've got to go it alone. We've got to go together in community and all of that. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think one of the things, if you've been hurt by people or you've had sort of negative experiences in church, I want to encourage you, as James would in James 1, to persevere through that. Because once you taste how sweet, authentic community can be, you're going to starve for it. You're going to go after it with all of your might. I've often said this, that God has put in my life godly people. And I feel very humbled by that because I've met so many of you who say, goodness, I'd love to have a man like that in my life. I'd love to have a person like that in my life. And I got to tell you, stay in the game. When you see godliness, hook your wagon up to that. Go after that person. Tell them you want to have coffee with them. Ask them, tell me your story. I want to learn from the context of your story. When you taste that kind of community, you'll never go back. You'll never not want to be in community. You'll know how to recognize unhealthy relationships, but go for the healthy ones. It's sweet and it's so strong and so life-giving as far as maturing in Christ. And so just wrapping it up, here's what you already know. 3 essentials for growing as a Christian. Paul says them right there. Put off, think differently, put on. Put off. Verse 22, you were taught with regard of your former way of life. Put off your old self. It's being corrupted. Leave that old life behind. When people turn to God, you read the story in the Bible, when they turned to God, they would get rid of things. You could read the book of Acts. When people were changed, and they would literally, big piles of stuff, they'd burn the old life. They would put it behind them. Let me ask you a question this morning, as you've probably been thinking about, what area of your life isn't under God's control? What area of your life, men, is not something that you've given over to God? Are you holding on to not forgiving? You've been there, the bitterness that comes from saying, I'm not going to forgive somebody because they've got to say sorry. Or no, lacking forgiveness will tear you apart. What about your sexuality? Where is that in your life? What about your own sin and selfishness, your own desires that you keep putting before God every time? We need to put them off. Paul says, secondly, think differently. Verse 23, put off, then be made new in the spirit of your mind. There is a mind thing going on here. We do need to begin to think differently. We do that by coming to Marketplace, by opening up our Bible, by studying that to renew our mind. You want to write down that classic passage, Romans 12, 1 and 2. Your spiritual act of worship is to offer yourself as a living sacrifice, but to be transformed, Paul would say, by the renewal of your mind. I used to hate this. I used to hate hate's probably a strong word, but how people would just turn on their computers and listen to great speakers. Have you been there? And we could find, we used to turn your radio on, punch a few things in the computer, and you can listen to the best speakers in the world. And I used to not like that because I thought, well, take people into their cars and out of the church. I think it was because I was just jealous that there were people out there that spoke better than I did, right? But it's true. There's a lot of people that are way better than anything you'd ever experience on a marketplace Bible study. That doesn't mean don't come or don't be a part of your church, but we have access to so many resources out there. I try to listen to books on tape that a friend of mine gives me, just going back and forth to my office. It's amazing how many books you can get through as part of renewing your mind. And I say all that to encourage you. Look up great speakers, read great books, hang out with great people, and begin to renew your mind. Begin to learn to think differently in your life. I think of people who have gone to jail. I've had opportunities in my life to do jail ministry, in and out of jails, and as a pastor, and teach and do church. And I've rarely ever met a person in jail who doesn't love the Lord. You ever meet, those of you guys who know that? You go to jail and they're like, man, I want to read my Bible. I want to get into your study group. And man, my life changed. And why are they doing that? Because they want out of jail. They want to go to that parole board. They want to get out early. And many times it happens. And what happens when they get out to those men, most of those guys? They go right back to the way they lived. And within a very short time, they're right back in jail. Because they didn't turn from their old way. They didn't put off. They didn't think differently. And they're back in jail. Sometimes I look at some of my friends whom that has happened to, and I said, you know what? You should stay in jail. You're so strong spiritually there. You see, when they come out of jail, they need to put new patterns in place. Why would they want to stay in the old life? You got to change. And then Paul says, lastly, put on. Start acting like a Christian. Even before you feel like being a Christian, act like a Christian. When you go to jail, people that get out of jail, they're so used to getting fed in jail, the lifestyle in jail, they don't know anything better. But none of them want to keep the old jumpsuit. They don't come out of jail and say, hey, can I keep that thing, that orange jumpsuit? Can I have that? I'd like to. They want to put that behind them because they're starting a new life. And if you have a new life, why would you want to stay in the old life? We need to put it off. We need to change our thinking and put on. I love the way Jerry Bridges, who wrote The Pursuit of Holiness and the Practice of Godliness in our life, he says it's like a pair of scissors. In the Greek language, it's not like you put off once and for all. You're going to be fighting this for the rest of your life, man. You're going to be constantly putting off that old nature. Paul says in Colossians 3:9, lie not one to another, seeing that you've put off the old man with his deeds. There's an ongoing idea, like one blade on a pair of scissors. Having one blade and a pair of scissors without the other, they don't work very well, right? But having two together, as you put off and then you put on the new, with Christ as the fulcrum on that and renewing of your mind, scissors begin to work. They're efficient because they work together. So as we're putting off, we're putting on. If you spend your whole life just putting off, you're a legalist. If you spend your whole life just putting on, but not putting off, you're delusional. You're just living a hyper-spiritual life, but you're not changing. And we see people doing that all the time in this world. I want to have a spiritual experience, but I don't want to change anything. And I could go on and talk about all of that. But most of us here, I hope you've been thinking a little bit on your life. Maybe there are some areas of my life that I need to think about putting off. And what I want to hear you to hear today, and this is why I often say I caution people being involved in a lot of different Bible studies, is because we get information overload. Have you been there? I go to church on Sunday. We're studying the fruit of the Spirit at our church. I go to a small group on Tuesday night. We're studying something different. I do a small group on Tuesday mornings. We're studying the foundations of the faith. There's another group that my wife and I are connected to on Saturday nights. We're studying something different. You can see how you just had information overload. And what does that do? It shuts the system down. It paralyzes. There's just so much we're taking in, we don't have time to grasp it all. And most of us will just be paralyzed by that. But if you can chew on one thing, if you're here this morning, you're thinking, what's one thing, or maybe in any of the groups that you go to, what is one thing I begin to practice in my life, to rub it in like a good meat rub on a steak? What's one thing I can do? That's what I encourage you to do. Don't be overwhelmed by all of the things in my life that I got strongholds in. Think of one thing that I can begin to put into practice this morning. I don't want to do a drive-by guilting. And here's the reality. Most of us are about as spiritually healthy as we want to be right now. Think about that for the moment. See, if I really wanted to get in shape, I would look at my calendar and I'd begin to change my calendar. I'd look at my relationships and I'd begin to hang out with people who would work out with me. I meet with a guy twice a week to go running. And if I didn't have that on my calendar, I wouldn't be running. My wife and I ride bikes 30 miles. And don't get this picture of us in spandex or anything like that. We're like an old couple on bikes running like 4 miles an hour, but we still put 30 miles in there. We do the miles. Every Friday we go 30 miles on a bike. I play hockey on a hockey team. Not because I'm good. I used to be good at hockey. I'm not good anymore. Because it's incredible exercise. It's on my calendar. I'm committed to going. I've actually put some money toward that. I'm committed to going. But, there are areas of my life like eating that I'm really struggling with that I know I'm pretty content with that, because if I really wanted to change, I would begin to buy different food. I'd begin to, what I'm saying, guys, is we've got to create an environment that's going to foster life change. But so many of us want life change, but we don't want to stop what we're doing. In a few weeks, you're going to hear some stories from some men that are going to challenge some of you in this area of change your calendar. And I hope, hopefully this will set it up for you as you come in here. Think of the lies that sometimes we believe about spiritual growth. And think of what Paul exhorted this church at Ephesus to say, now that you believe, here's what it looks like in your life. Not my life or Dave's life or Barry's life or Richard Blackaby's life, but your life. God's given you one life to live. He's given you one chance and umpteen chances of redemption and forgiveness in our lives. It's an endless card of just bringing our stuff before the Lord and saying, God, help me put this off. Help me by the power of your Spirit to put this on and renew me and change me so that I can be a light to the world.